Hello, and welcome to another episode of the William Branham Historical Research Podcast. I'm your host, John Collins, the author and founder of William Branham Historical Research at william-branham.org, and with me I have my very special guest, Garrett Richardson, former member of Faith Assembly Satellite Group in Grand Rapids. Garrett, it's so good to have you on today to share your story about Hobart Freeman and the Faith Assembly cult. As you know, we've had so many people contact us, and some who have now shared their story about Faith Assembly, and they all share very similar stories, no matter which satellite group they're in. And it's just fascinating to me to hear them, because in the message cult of William Branham, we had the main sect and all of its splinter groups, but they did vary quite a bit if you really think about the internal structure. But what I'm hearing from the Faith Assembly cult is that at least until the group imploded, it became very like tentacles of the same group in different various places. And I'm very interested to hear your story about the satellite group that was in Grand Rapids.
Well, I'm not sure how far back to go, other than I guess I should start with when I got saved. I was 24 years old and became a Christian. I later found that to be during the big Jesus revolution, I guess. And but my wife got saved. We had been going through some trouble. She got saved, and then a guy started where I work who actually attended the Faith Assembly satellite group. So he would talk about Jesus all day to me, and then I would go home and my wife would talk about Jesus all night. And they both kept telling me I needed to be saved, and I knew that. So I became a Christian, and we tried to find a church. We were on fire. I mean, all we wanted to do was hear more and more about Jesus. So we tried all the denominational churches, her parents' church, my parents' church, all around the area. And everybody, all they wanted to talk about was their parking lot funds and, their programs. And finally, I decided to try the church with the guy at work. And I went to the little storefront church one evening. And I was really shocked when I went in there to see people just dressed in muumuus and shorts and flip-flops and playing tambourines and drums, trumpet, you name it. It was in there. And it was a very small building. There was maybe 50 of us in there. And they were jumping up and down and shouting. And I was kind of put off at first by the whole thing, but then when the teacher showed up about an hour after all the praise and worship, and he taught on the Sermon on the Mount, and it was very literal, and I mean literal. Turn the other cheek meant actually turn the other cheek, and give them your cloak as well as your coat. It actually meant to do that. And I was amazed that somebody was actually preaching the word and taking it literally, not trying to dispensationalize it or, denominationalize it, is what we would say. And I went home and I told my wife, one thing happened that night, my very first night in the meeting. One of the older guys there got a hold of me and told me I needed to be baptized in the Holy Spirit. So they laid hands on me and coached me into speaking in tongues, because they said that you don't have the baptism in the Holy Spirit unless you speak in tongues. And it was quite an experience. It was embarrassing. But when I went away, it was still the message on the Sermon on the Mount that I was so taken by. And I went and told my wife that she needed to hear this. My wife was pregnant with our second child at the time. And I finally talked her into coming. And like on the first or second night of the teaching, they tried to talk her into having her baby at home. and she said that's not going to happen. So it was slow going at first, but I was just so convinced that the things that they were saying were genuine, and it was so exciting that we continued to go. And we did have that baby in the hospital, by the way.
One of the things that you mentioned was that it was embarrassing, and a lot of people haven't really processed that yet after leaving these kind of groups. But when you first get around them, whereas if you went to a normal church, they make you feel welcome and they invite you and they teach you in the things that they believe. In these cult groups, what I've noticed is that there is a form of embarrassment that happens, and I don't know that they're trained to do this, but it's almost as though the embarrassment is part of the strategy that makes a person indoctrinated, because you get shaken off guard whenever this happens. And people notice whenever that happens, when you get shaken off guard, and they mistakenly see that as the spirit or whatever the movement calls it. But you get shaken enough, you join the group, and like you said, you weren't there for that part. You were there for the Sermon on the Mount part. And so there's this interest that connects you, and then those who take part in that embarrassment, they see that as a sign from God that they've now made a conversion.
I also believe that those embarrassments were made me feel like they were so much more spiritually intelligent than I was. And I wanted what they had. I wanted to, because I had a banjo at the time, and I decided I was never going to learn how to play it. So I asked one of the musicians, I said, "You wouldn't happen to know someone that wants to buy a banjo, would you?" And he said, "No, I wouldn't. Watch your confession." And that's when I started to realize that all this positive thinking and confession, I was not just embarrassed by that, but I was a little put off, and I could sense a pride really coming from them when they did things like that.
Yeah, that's odd, and that brings back memories of myself. I grew up in different Branham organizations and Branham churches from coast to coast, and some parts of the country, they were into the bluegrass style gospel music, and you'd go to church on Sunday and you'd hear people playing anything from banjos to dobros to who knows what. But then when I came back to Jeffersonville, there were strict rules against stringed instruments. That's how they phrased it, stringed instruments. Brother Branham did not like those. And I'm scratching my head as a musician. I'm thinking, well, you got a piano in the church, man. That is a stringed instrument. What are you guys thinking? And so I never will forget. I've got a banjo now, and I wish I could play it better than I can. But I remember clearly when I moved here, there were people that did exactly that style of it. It's almost like righteous indignation type of embarrassment. They want you to know that they know that you're in the wrong, and they want to tell you about it. Instead of convincing you of their opinion, they want to tell you that it's wrong and condemn you. So for me, it was like, it was much, much worse when I moved to Jeffersonville, but it was like a gospel of condemnation.
Yes. In this building that we attended, for the first, it seems like we were there for a year or two. My wife and I called it the Union Street Polka Band, because it sounded like a polka band with the drums and the guitars and the tambourines and all that, and it had that bounce to it. It was fun, I will say that. But during that time is when I got a lot of those little jabs from people about what we were wearing, some of our language that didn't quite fit the lingo that they used. And I later discovered that cults pretty much have their own language, little key phrases, that would be repeated all the time, in just words like blessing or edification or the blood of Jesus, or, and all of these things, they could have had their own little dictionary of terms and phrases that they used. And I would get straightened out on a regular basis. But still, the message kept me coming back. And then when I became comfortable with the message and started to conform, I guess, I was way more comfortable. And, everybody just seemed to love each other, and they were concerned about each other. And I hadn't experienced any of these kinds of things in a regular church. I was raised a Methodist. And when I was 18, I ran screaming from that. And I did everything wrong that I could find, and which, like I said, led me to getting saved in the first place. But everything they started to say about denominations, I would just go, yeah, that's right, because I was there. I remember how they would, and some of them even would say tongues were of the devil. And we were told that was borderline blasphemy of the Holy Spirit, and you can't be forgiven for that. That's what we were told.
Very similar to what we were told. And the loaded language is something that just fascinates me, because every once in a while I'll be talking to somebody on one of these podcasts and something will come out that was programmed in my head as loaded language. And I can tell by their face when they hear it, they're like, what did he just say? That didn't really make any sense. And then on the opposite hand, if somebody I'm talking to is in a different group or even a splinter group of the same movement I was from, their loaded language was just slightly different. So they'll say things, and I'm scratching my head trying to figure out, I know that word means a thing, that I know exactly what the word means, but they're using it in a different context than what I recognize. And they don't realize it, I don't realize it. It's almost as if they're speaking Swahili and I'm speaking English. But that's one of the things that all of these destructive cults have in common. And the fascinating part for me, from just a psychology aspect, it has become cultural. It's not like it was any form of deception to create the loaded language, but because the group think, everybody's thinking and talking and acting the same way, rather than say a long paragraph of words, they can sum it up in one phrase, and then it becomes common language among them. And it makes me think of the broader picture of how just languages themselves evolved over time, but they're evolving in this small cult group.
Yeah, the way we spoke was one thing, but the things that they were talking about was kind of foreign to me also. I mean, with all of the new things that I was not ever subjected to, baptism in the Holy Spirit, divine healing, things that were just way over my head at the time. So a lot of the times I just kept my mouth shut and learned. And I remember I got in 1979 and some of the guys wanted to take a trip down to Faith Assembly. And I went with them, and they drove us by the Glory Barn, and I felt like I was seeing the Parthenon. Here's this structure with this great big Glory Barn painted on the side of it, and we just kind of drove by on our way, and everybody's pointing and talking about how the building used to rock when they would get to praising the Lord in there. They would dance, but it was more of a jig, I guess, to jumping up and down. And once in a while, you'd see somebody take off around the room. But and that was all very foreign to me.
It's interesting. In the Branham Tabernacle, it was the opposite. The music was so dry. I grew up, like I said, other churches where people liked music and they had all kinds of instruments. And in the Branham Tabernacle, I can remember I had just moved there from a place that had really, really good music. And I moved there, and some guy got excited whenever they were singing I'll Fly Away, and he started clapping his hands, and he was wanting to go faster. And in the cult rules of that building, you weren't allowed to clap your hands. You weren't. It wasn't like it was a thing that they verbalized, but they took offense if you did it. And so the song leader looked straight at the guy who's clapping his hands and said, "Okay, let's slow this down now." And he started singing it at least 5 times slower than that song should ever be sung. And I was like, what in the world are they doing? And then I realized later, well, they've got this new rule and they're not even telling the guy that he's violating the rules. And I didn't know, so I was half violating the rules. I was clapping my hands. But we felt exactly like you described, the Parthenon. This was Mecca for us when we came to Jeffersonville. The church had a special place. And then when I moved here, it was even further that way. I would take pride in the building, and I would tell people that's the building where I went. And in hindsight, I look back at some of the things that people said whenever I said that, and I realized that they knew something was off about the place. But I was taking pride in it, so I didn't notice it.
Well, the music obviously was way different than it was for you, because the faster the better for us, and they would chain songs together so much that you couldn't catch your breath, and this went on for an hour. And then every once in a while they'd take a break and somebody would prophesy or have a tongues and interpretation or something like that. But the music was it was like everything. It was very, very lively. And then one day they said, "We can't sing Amazing Grace anymore." And they actually taught from the pulpit why we weren't allowed to sing Amazing Grace was because it said, "Who saved a wretch like me," and we aren't wretches. So that was a negative confession, and they banned the song. And that's when I noticed that things started changing, as far as it was such a warm and wonderful, lively group. And then they banned that song, and eventually it came out from the pulpit that it was the homosexual culture of California that developed the running shoe, and we couldn't wear running shoes anymore. And at that time, there was a running shoe explosion, and that's about all you could buy at the store. So it was a little more difficult to find shoes. Then the same thing happened with bomber jackets and some other stuff. By this time now, they taught on head coverings. The women had to wear, well, anything that pertained to a woman and not a man. That was for sure. There was no pants, and there were head coverings. And then piercings kind of went by the wayside. And I remember them saying, "This is not a religion of don'ts. This is a religion of do's." And they never used the term religion either. I have to say, it was always some other spiritual term, because I heard somebody say one time about religion. He said something about most religious people don't know Jesus. And I heard a lot of comments over those years.
Yeah, I heard similar things too, and I think everybody who's came on has mentioned some way, shape, or form in which the groups made an us versus them between you and other Christians. And I can remember that feeling after I left, what it was like just being around the people that we had so strongly condemned, and realizing, wait a minute, these are good people too. They are trying their best to serve Jesus, and they, obviously didn't believe like I did after I had first left, but I came to realize that many of the things that I said about them weren't quite true.
My wife got pregnant again, and this time it was planned that we were going to have the baby at home. And I believe by this time we were getting more and more teachings about healing. And my wife threw her glasses away. I started believing for my teeth, which were in terrible shape. and then we went ahead and had the baby at home. And we had a midwife from the church that came and helped. And it was quite an experience, I have to say. As we moved along, we ended up having 4 of our children at home. And the last one, it was just my wife and I alone. During that time, the song leader at the church, I don't know how much detail I should give because I don't want to offend anybody, so I certainly won't use his name, but his wife had a baby, and they went to have that baby at home, and it got stuck in the birth canal and was stillborn. And before they were able to get the baby out of her, everybody ran. They left her and left him to deal with the police and the coroner, and she was paralyzed from the waist down. And so the church decided that there was either a lack of faith or there was sin in their life, and they took him out from that position of being the song leader. And they knew that I could sing because I had gotten up and shared one song, and I'm a singer from some way back. And they put me in the position as song leader, and I couldn't even play a guitar at the time, but I learned very quickly, and I became the song leader. I'm thinking that was 3 maybe years in when that happened.
I can't even imagine. I've been thinking through some of the testimonies people have given me out of Faith Assembly, and it's just horrifying to think that people were suffering to that extent. And then on top of the normal suffering that they have, the paralysis, etc., now they've got the spiritual rejection because of the series of unfortunate events that happened to them. So above and beyond the physical pains that they're dealing with, they also have the mental anguish that goes with it. I can't even imagine what that was like. How did people cope with this?
I'm not sure what kind of recovery it took for like her mentally. Physically, she wasn't even able to walk. They had to bring her into the meetings in a chair, a stuffed chair. They wouldn't use a wheelchair, and they carried her in a chair, and she would sit way in the back. But I know from later on that it pretty much ended their marriage, but it wasn't for quite a while yet. By this time, the ministry was, preaching divine healing all the way, and we all wanted to be a part of the message. We were zealous to show that we had faith, and everybody was on board with the message. So it wasn't until later, much later, that Hobart Freeman came out and started saying that doctors were of the devil, and if you go to the arm of the flesh, that you could lose your salvation. And people will say, well, he never said that, but he certainly did. And it wasn't just implied. I mean, I can recall him coming right out and saying that doctors were butchers, and if you go to those butchers, then you're going to get what you deserve. So we were on his mailing list and somebody else's mailing list, and then we were sitting under our teaching here in Grand Rapids 2 times a week. And very early, the teacher that I first heard preaching on the Sermon on the Mount died of kidney failure, I later found out. When somebody would die, it's like they fell off the face of the map. And they were very tight-lipped about what happened to them. They just disappeared. And eventually you would get somebody to cloak their gossip in some kind of spiritual context, and you would find out what really happened. Because there were a lot of gossips in that church. People are people. And we found out that he died with kidney failure, but he went to the doctor first when it happened. And then he was pulled out of the teaching. He couldn't be a fivefold minister because he went to the doctor. So he disappeared. And then later we got word that he actually died because he recanted, asked for forgiveness, and then didn't go back to the doctor. And that's when he died. And that seemed to happen quite a few times. And, the question would always come up. There was only the two answers. Either they had a lack of faith or they had sin in their life. And I would always hear the quote from Smith Wigglesworth. You'd hear this all the time. Faith that fizzles out at the finish had a flaw in it from the first. They would quote it so often that I actually wrote it in the first leaf of my Bible, because it's what we live by, and it was like just a constant barrage of this teaching repeatedly 2 times a week, plus the tapes, which I listened to at least 4 hours of teaching on headphones while I was at work every day. I had to wear headphones to run my machine anyway, so I piped all that through the headphones. And it just became like it's brainwashing. And they would admit that in the teaching. They admitted that, of course, you're being brainwashed. It's the washing of your mind by the water of the word, and they were so proud of it.
It's so hard to believe. I'm a science fiction fan, I've mentioned a few times, and there's a recurring theme in both horror and science fiction where there's a town, everybody is so closely tied together, they're all overly friendly, more than the usual town, and some stranger arrives and they he starts to see what's happening, and then suddenly one person disappears and the whole town just doesn't realize that this person is gone. It's like he never existed. But the new guy or a new family or whatever, they remember the person. Where'd this person go? And I have to believe that the authors of those stories have experienced in some way, shape, or form the way a cult works, because that's the way it is. What you're describing, that they forgot about the person, and or like you said, they find out he goes to the doctor and he's being chastised. That's the reason why all of this happened to him. Well, in the stories from the science fiction, the same kind of thing. They stumble upon something that the person did, and that was they look at that as the root cause rather than, well, hey, what happened? Where did this person disappear to? And it's fascinating to me to think that the minds can do that. I had friends who left the message whenever I was in it, and I'm not like that. I'm more of a people person, so I would always walk both sides of the fence. And in hindsight, I'm certain that they look bad at me for this too. But I liked people. I love all people, and I can't imagine a group taking that away from me. But there are people who get so, like you said, brainwashed. There are people that their minds get so fully purged of the human nature that they take on the cult identity to the extent that they will cut off their friends. Have you ever wondered how the Pentecostal movement started, or how the progression of modern Pentecostalism transitioned through the latter rain, charismatic, and other fringe movements into the New Apostolic Reformation? You can learn this and more on William Branham Historical Research's website, william-branham.org. On the books page of the website, you can find the compiled research of John Collins, Charles Paisley, Stephen Montgomery, John McKinnon, and others, with links to the paper, audio, and digital versions of each book. You can also find resources and documentation on various people and topics related to those movements. If you want to contribute to the cause, you can support the podcast by clicking the Contribute button at the top. And as always, be sure to like and subscribe to the audio or video version that you're listening to or watching. On behalf of William Branham Historical Research, We want to thank you for your support.
Being friendly was still in my vocabulary. As a song leader, I got no special treatment from the fivefold ministers. I never received a phone call from any of them. None of them ever took me out to dinner or any such a thing as that. I never had any contact, really. Even the teacher that came to teach at Grand Rapids, to me, looking back on it, he was actually kind of rude. And but the people there tend to believe that I was something a little higher on the food chain. So my wife and I did a lot of entertaining. We had people over to the house that we would pray and sing and have big dinners and that kind of fellowship kind of knit the group together. And we did it a lot. At one time, I rented a whole roller skating ring. I had to rent the whole thing because I couldn't have them running it and playing their music. So I could control the situation by renting the whole place. That was just one of the things we did. We did a lot of things like that. And then sometimes later I would hear through the grapevine that the teacher didn't agree with what we were doing. And it was a little bit, it smacked of worldliness or whatever title they wanted to put on it. But like I said, I got no special treatment being a song leader for the last 5 or 6 years that I was there.
So I'm fascinated with being a song leader and being close to the leadership. I don't know if it was the same way in Hobart Freeman's group, but in the Branham Tabernacle and many of the satellite groups, there were tiers of cult elite, cult royalty, and once you got into the musicians tier, it was more than other churches. It's just a musician, or I guess now they have music ministers, they call it, but they're just solely focused upon leading the music and the worship. But in the cult groups, it's like a hierarchy, and so you have elevated status. What was it like for you being a song leader? Did you feel this status? Did you feel like you had a rank higher than other people?
Not at all. In fact, we were taught. Maybe that happened in other groups, and even at the Faith Assembly. I mean, I know the song leader at the Faith Assembly. He was a very humble, very nice guy. But I didn't feel that it elevated me in any way because I heard the tapes on humility, for one thing, and I didn't get, like I said, I didn't get treated with any special treatment from the fivefold ministers. And we would have, after our first teacher died, we would have our regular teacher on Tuesday night, and then they did a rotation of fivefold ministers on Friday night every week. And we never knew who was going to show up on Friday. So I couldn't count how many different teachers we received from the Faith Assembly body on a Friday night. Nobody would come on Sunday because they all wanted to be there for Dr. Freeman's Sunday service. So we had church on Tuesdays and Fridays. And at times I would sing for at least an hour. I would keep things going. And sometimes the teacher driving up to Grand Rapids from Indiana, we'd get stuck in traffic and, we'd have to sing for an hour and a half. Nobody ever seemed to really mind. But for us having little children in the assembly, we had to keep them sitting in the chairs with us, and they had to be quiet the whole time. Well, they could sing and clap their hands and dance with us when we were praising, but when the teacher was preaching, and that would be an hour minimum, and sometimes two if they were really long-winded, and our children would have to sit there quiet. And it's one of my deepest regrets that I disciplined my children if they weren't perfectly quiet And we would go to restaurants, and I would take all 7 of my children, and people would come up to us constantly and say, I can't believe how good your children are. And it was a source of pride for us. But looking back on it, I hate to admit this. We beat them into submission. It was the teaching believed in corporal punishment. Spare the rod, spoil the child. Beat the child with the rod, and he will not die. There was all this teaching about that, and we did. On a lighter note, when we were in a restaurant one time, a guy came up to me and asked me if all those children were ours together, or if we were a blended family. And I said, no, they're ours. And he goes, all single birth? And I go, yeah. And he turned to the guy next to him and he goes, you win. And he said, I bet that guy that was a blended family, and he paid for our whole dinner. That was the deal that they made with each other. And
wow,
that was one of the funniest things that ever happened.
I remember the same exact thing. The children, man, they were just, I'm embarrassed as a parent to think that I was in that same mindset, but I was. We all were. And I can remember, I think it just came out, but I was talking about this to somebody else. When you walk in the Branham Tabernacle, the first thing you heard if you came in late was the bathroom off to the right was the ladies' room, and you could hear some kid being beaten half to death in there and screaming, no, stop it, don't do this to me. Because if they didn't sit still very long, they were punished, like you said. And I've got family members, I'm not going to mention names, but whenever you went over to their house was immaculate. And the lady would literally lay down a blanket, and the children, who normal kids throw toys everywhere, well, the children would not bring a toy off of the edge of the blanket because they were beaten that deeply into submission. And like you said, they prided themselves in it. They were happy that they abused the children like this. And I look back and I can't believe that we did this. But the long services was probably the most abuse, because no kid's going to sit still for two hours. I remember in one service, it got so long the adults were getting uncomfortable, and one guy stood up and raised his hand and started pointing at his watch like this at the end of the service. And you could see the preacher's face just in state of shock that this guy did this, and he ended his service. But I want to say it was like 3 p.m. It was a long service, and I was starving as a kid, but I sat through it, and half the kids got beat because of this long service.
Unfortunately, that wasn't the end of the children's suffering, was how we treated them. I mean, we loved our children, and we let them know that too, but the discipline was over the top. But we also put them into public school, and then they were left in the school system to take a stand with their teachers, because they couldn't celebrate any holidays. And they usually would take our kids and put them with the Jehovah's Witnesses in the library, or they would have to sit in a chair out in the hallway while all the other kids had their little holiday parties. There was artwork he couldn't do. There was music he couldn't listen to. When they would show movies, he couldn't be a part of that. Any of my kids. It's a good thing that we got out before all of my kids were in school. I think I had 3 in the public school system while we were still in there. And it was, the teachers hated us. And I remember having a lot of difficulty with my oldest boy's teacher as a result of him not being able to partake. I could tell that she totally disagreed with us. So that was a whole nother sense of punishment for our children, making them take that stand out there, even though I'm sure they didn't want to. They couldn't play with the same toys. I later found out that my oldest boy had a Stretch Armstrong in his desk at school. And so anyways, I thought we were all walking in the light, all following the message, and all making our children do the same. And it wasn't until like we were in for over 8 years, just over, and it wasn't until I got out that I started hearing some of the other stories. And I found out that not everybody was both feet in, all gung ho like we were. And it shocked me. The people in my tight group were believing for their eyes and their teeth and their families, uh, and having babies at home. And but later I found out there were other people in the meeting that weren't really living it, or even making their kids live it. And that's when, after we got out, that I first heard about somebody whose kid died and they put him in the trunk of their car. I guess that happened down in Indiana, and they were believing that the Lord was going to raise him up. And I mean, shocking stories like that. Those kinds of things we never heard until we got out. The little girl who had a tumor that grew over her eye, and it grew so big that it came down and covered her face, and she suffocated. Uh, so much of it was unnecessary, but yet while we were walking in it, we were absolutely convinced that they were going to receive their manifestation. They prayed for it. They asked God for it. So they had already received it, and then there was nothing to do but wait for the manifestation. And you would see it all over the place, people with different ailments that was obvious that they were believing for them. Had a good friend up here, a woman who came in to our assembly and dumped her thyroid medication and her blood pressure and medicine. And she was in her 60s. And I don't think she lasted a month. Had a massive stroke and died. And her family was irate about the whole thing. We would have counseled her to sit under the message a little bit longer before you do that. But she was so convinced that, and I knew others that threw away their medication and died. And we were always left with, in the world, everybody says, why does God allow bad things to happen to good people? That's the thing they're all messed up about. And for us, it was, why did this person who was seemingly walking this message die? And we were only left with the two, other than Hobart Freeman, we were only left with those two alternatives: that there was sin in their life, or they didn't have enough faith. However, when Hobart Freeman died, it was God took him away like Elijah, because we were focusing on the man instead of the mission. And we continued to go for 2 or 3 years, I think, after Hobart Freeman died. That's how long the momentum kept us going, until my wife decided to put her glasses back on. And that was an eye opener. I don't know. She listened to a tape by one of the fivefold ministers about what is a cult. And it was so ironic that she came away from that realizing that we were in a cult. And it was their tape that opened her eyes to that. And I was the song leader, so it was a little awkward for me, because she put her glasses back on, and I was willing to accept that, she was having a crisis of faith. But that's when I've heard from the fivefold ministers. They never spoke to me really until then. And our teacher pulled me aside and said he didn't want my wife speaking to anybody else in the church. He said he didn't care if she wanted to share chili recipes, but she is looked up to, and he doesn't want her teaching the younger women in the assembly. Obviously, he said, she's lost the faith. and he told me that I needed to get my house in order. But they didn't pull me out of the position. I was still the song leader, and my wife was wearing her glasses now. And it was an eye opener, because in my little speech when I left there, I got up in front of the assembly and gave a speech pretty much about why we were leaving. And in it, I said, when my wife put her glasses back on, we were confronted with the same unloving, uncaring, rude behavior that we showed other people when they didn't agree with us. And I realized how rude and arrogant we were with this message.
That's a hard realization to come to. I remember when that hit me after leaving, I went back mentally. I took note of everybody that I could remember who I encountered. Many people who were trying, I think, to get me out of this cult that I was in, and some of the things that they were saying were probably true, but because of my pride, I was thinking they were sinners going to hell, trying to, lure me into Satan's Eden. That was one of our loaded languages, Satan's Eden. And so we look down upon people so badly. And once I left, I started reading the Bible over and over and over. I read it. I lost count of the times, but cover to cover, I kept reading it, and I started noticing that the sin of pride is one of the most frequently mentioned sins in the New Testament. And I got to thinking about the way that I had treated other people, thinking that I was a better Christian than them, in fact, thinking they were non-Christian. And then the deeper thought hit me, what does it mean to be Christian? Whenever you use that word, what does it mean? And for me, I was Christian because I believed in Christ and because I followed William Branham as my prophet. And I realized that triad doesn't exist in the Bible. There are many passages that say there is no mediator between God and man. You go directly to God. And then I started thinking about all of the other cult groups and trying to determine what's different about this other group compared to what we had. And I remember thinking clearly they're a cult because they followed this man, and I was doing the same exact thing that they were doing and didn't even really pay attention to it. I was so caught up in it. So I know exactly what you're saying, and it's hard to put that into words that somebody who has never experienced can even fathom.
It was pretty harsh when we got out that the people that I worked with, denominational people, came to me and said, we always knew you were wrong. When I admitted that it was a cult in front of one guy, he said, stop saying that. It makes you sound stupid. And I realized that people didn't understand the pull. It was very difficult to explain why you would do something that this man said. And we did it willingly. I did it. I was overjoyed to comply when Hobart Freeman said, no more minor music, or he said, no more hunting. We could hardly wait for the next month's tapes because it was always some new and different, deeper, and that was it. It was deeper life in the spirit. And he always had some new revelation for us, and we felt really blessed by that. As it progressed, like I said, he started to say that doctors were butchers of the devil, and then he started, banning this, that, and the other thing. And I can't explain that. I mean, maybe now I could. I did a little bit of work with the Cult Awareness Network when we got out. And we traveled around mostly to Lutheran churches and spoke to their youth groups about how to recognize and avoid getting into a cult. But I shouldn't have been doing that because I can speak maybe for both my wife and I that we were very damaged, and we walked away without getting any counseling. And there we were trying to guide the youth of America into avoiding cults. And it just eventually became too much for us. The fear that God was going to strike us dead or our children. I mean, the first year out, we had 2 broken arms. I had a tumor removed from my skull. We had a baby in the hospital. And I mean, this is the first year out, and we were absolutely convinced that God was going to kill us for leaving this message. We didn't want to leave the Lord. We wanted to get out from underneath that message, which we found out was wrong. And again, I don't know about naming names, but one of the big helps that helped us to see this was after my wife put her glasses on, we found a book at the Christian bookstore called the Health and Wealth Gospel, and there was a chapter on Faith Assembly in there. And I know I wasn't supposed to, but I looked at it, and I just remember a really cold feeling coming up my throat, and I felt like I had devoted my entire life to this thing. And I thought, I never even entertained the possibility that we were actually wrong. And then it started to come on me that, yes, we could have been wrong. And we went down to Indiana and met with an ex-assistant pastor and talked to him at great length. He didn't want to talk to us at first, but I took my whole family down there, and he was very, very good to us. We spent the whole afternoon discussing it, and then I came back from that meeting, and I wrote up a little speech and got up in front of the assembly on a Friday night. Instead of taking my guitar, I just brought my little piece of paper, and I read this speech to the entire group about, I said, we had some questions about this message, and I said that the way we were, the reaction that we got from asking a question was very unloving, and people were so threatened by it that it just helped me to realize that that it was wrong. I said, we didn't have questions about minor things like why don't we have a Sunday school for our children, or why don't they have speakers in the room where the ladies go to nurse. It wasn't that. I said we had questions that went to the core of the message, and I said I can't in good conscience stay here anymore. And most everybody tried to pray in tongues over what I was saying loudly. And a couple of them jumped up and said, wait a minute, we should pray about this. And I said, don't you think I've already prayed about this? And 11 of us got up and walked out that night. And honestly, that was the beginning of the end for the assembly. I don't think it went on much longer. If they lasted a year, I would be surprised. And the entire thing started to fall apart around that time, even down in Indiana. So I have to believe that God was in that. I tried to find another church. I didn't want to give up on Jesus. And after about 15 churches, I discovered that it was too hard for me to find another church, because I had the book Every Wind of Doctrine that Hobart Freeman wrote, and I knew everything that was wrong with everybody else except us. And it was impossible to sit under any denomination, even an undenominational church. That was a denomination in itself to us. And we ended up, even after the Cult Awareness Network, we crashed and burned and went right back into where we were. It's like we picked up where we were in our 20s, only now we're in our late 30s. And I went back to drugs and alcohol, and we ended up divorcing, my wife and I. And but God was still with us. It's an odd story, but we were apart for a year, and we got back together. And after 6 years, we remarried. So I'm still with the wife of my youth, and but we went through some very, very hard times there. I don't advise anybody to walk away from a cult and not go get some kind of counseling. There's depths to that you just don't know what you're in for when you do something like that. I experienced all the stages of grief, anger, sadness. I think there's like 6 different stages of grief, and I went through all of them, and then went through all of them again, and it took us about 20 years before we got back into a church.
Well, it's so good that you did get back together. And, I think a lot of people who join a cult later in life, they experience to some extent what you said. It's as though their life was sucked away from them for a period of time, and then they re-enter right where they left off. And even the age, no matter what age you got pulled out, I've seen people who got sucked into a cult as a teenager, and they tell me that when they came back in to the real world, the quote-unquote normal world, they said that they entered back in and they still had, even to some extent, the mindset of the adolescent or teenager that they were whenever they had joined. So anyway, it sounds like you made it through okay. You got back with your wife, and things look good from the other side. So thank you so much for sharing the story with us.
Well, thank you for asking for it. Oh, by the way, I would like you to know that what you and Chino have spoken of has been a great deal of help in healing some of the things that I didn't realize were still up there in my head.
Well, good. I'm so glad that we were able to help in some way. So if you've enjoyed our show and you want more information, you can check us out on the web. You can find us at william-branham.org. For more about the dark side of the New Apostolic Reformation, you can read Weaponized Religion, From Christian Identity to the NAR, available on Amazon, Kindle, and soon, Audible.